Hello everyone, my name is Claire and I'm the founder of Sister Mountain, where I design knitting patterns and teach knitting pattern design to knitters like you. Today I'm going to be talking about something that knitters tend to face at some point, and that is knitting to a deadline. Whether it's knitting a gift or test knitting maybe for someone, sample knitting, or even knitting the sample of your own design, knitting to a deadline is something that we all face. And in today's video, I'm going to be sharing some practical tips with you about how to knit to a deadline without stressing yourself out. So, let me share a story with you about something that happened a few years ago to me, and it was something kind of amazing. I was a relatively new designer, and I had been, I submitted a couple of designs to Woolfolk, to one of their design submissions, and believe it or not, they selected both of my designs. I was over the moon. I couldn't believe that Woolfolk would want to work with me, and of course I jumped at the chance. But what I didn't fully understand is what a massive undertaking that would be. I was designing two sweaters and knitting the samples that were in a very fine yarn, or one was a very, very fine yarn, one was less fine, but it was not, I think it was like a DK or something. And they were both oversized. One of them was sized, I forget, but they were basically very big samples, a lot of knitting to do. And they gave me a decent chunk of time, but even then, I think I just hadn't fully understood how long it would take me, sorry, my knitting got tangled, how long it would take me to actually complete both of these samples, as well as do all of the technical stuff that comes with designing a pattern, right? So instead of loving the experience, it ended up being one of the most challenging times in my career as a knitting pattern designer. And it was because I hadn't budgeted my time well. I spent too long on one sample so that I didn't have that much time left to knit the other sample. And as the deadline loomed, you would have found me every night sat up knitting until the early hours, hands cramping, elbows kind of starting to hurt. I could feel a sense of like repetitive strain injury coming in. I was exhausted because I was doing this for days on end. And yeah, I was just like pretty miserable. I met the deadline, but it was that experience that made me decide that I was never going to put myself through that again. That if I was going to commit to a deadline, I needed to be very clear with myself about how I was going to meet that deadline without getting to the point where I'm having to like sacrifice, basic human needs like sleep. So yeah, let's talk about that in this video, because I do not want the same experience to happen to you. So before you even pick up your needles, it is really important that you set some kind of milestones for your project. So I'm assuming that you will at this stage know your deadline. The deadline is the day that you either need to have, your test knit complete by, to like kind of promote the new design, or it might be the date that you're going to gift someone the project that you've knitted for them as a gift. It might be the release date of a knitting pattern that you've knitted the sample for, or maybe if you're a sample knitter, the date that the designer has asked you to get that sample back to them by. So yeah, that's the date that it needs to be like done and dusted. But that doesn't mean that you can knit all the way up to that point, right? There are lots of other considerations to think about that are part of the kind of knitting process, the sample knitting process or project knitting process. Things like shipping. So for example, if you are gifting something, or maybe you are a sample knitter and you need to get the sample over to the designer, or maybe you are a designer and you've knitted a sample for a publication and you need to get that sample over to the publication that you designed it for. You need to think about where are you shipping it to, and how long is that going to take? And of course, you don't want to be shipping it so that it's going to arrive on the day of the deadline, because what if something goes wrong? You maybe want to get it there a couple of days before the deadline just to give yourself some buffer time. So that's something to consider. Also, things like blocking. You know, you finish your project, but that doesn't mean it's finished. There is still important things like blocking, making sure it's blocked out to the desired size that you want it to be. Things like finishing as well. Maybe you have some ends to weave in, buttons to sew on, embroidery to do. So you really need to consider, you know, how long is that going to take you realistically? If you live somewhere like me, where even in summer, things that are blocking can take quite a while to dry, then you may even want to leave, you know, 3 days for your sample to dry. For those of you who live in climates where your samples dry within a day, I'm so jealous because that's not the case over here. So those are things to consider. And then also you would want to think about things like photography. So if you are a designer and you are photographing your final pattern photos, then that's something to think about, because I'm assuming that you'll probably want to work with natural light. You're probably not working with a studio, although maybe you are working with a studio, and therefore you need to have your sample done and dusted, ready to get it photographed on a certain day. Excuse me, that was my buzzer of the door. I'm going to ignore it. But yeah, it could be that. It could be that you are maybe working with a loved one or a friend who's going to take your photos for you, maybe a family member, and they're only available on a certain day. Maybe they're only available on weekends, or maybe you can only take photos at weekends. So again, that's kind of part of your timeline that you need to account for. And these all eat into that kind of overall amount of time that you have to meet your deadline. So say you had, I don't know, a hat that you needed to knit and it's due in 30 days. But when you accommodate blocking, shipping maybe, finishing touches, maybe you want to photograph it, all of that, maybe that's going to eat up, you know, maybe 8 of those days, then that means that you have 22 days to work your samples. So having that kind of considered when planning the timeline of your project, and having these kind of milestones marked into the overall timeline will really do you a favour, because the last thing you want to do is finish your sample and then realise, actually, I haven't given myself enough time to do all the finishings, all of the blocking. Maybe you need to ship it and you realise you're going to have to ship it with your sample kind of damp. Like that's really not what you want to be doing. It's not going to be a stress-free experience for you. So thinking about that at the very beginning is really going to do you a favour in terms of making the process as stress-free as possible. Okay, so once you have all of your milestones in the calendar and you know exactly how many days you have available to knit, the next step is to work out your approximate knitting speed. And the way you would do that is you would take the ball of yarn, like the ball of yarn that you're working with, and it really doesn't have to be at the beginning of the project. Say you're in the middle of a project and you want to work out how long the remaining part of the project is going to take you to complete. You can still do the same thing. But yeah, take the ball of yarn that you're going to be working with and weigh it. Now, I highly recommend that you write this down, because if you're anything like me, you will forget the starting weight of your yarn. So write that down, and then I recommend that you knit for about an hour. Set a timer so you know exactly how long you knitted for, and at the very end, once the timer's gone off, weigh the ball of yarn that you initially weighed and see how much you knitted. Then you can use that information to know, okay, well, I know that if I knit for an hour, I can use up roughly this amount of yarn. It's not going to be, you know, fully accurate, but it will be a good guideline. And then what you can do is use the total amount left that you have to knit your project. And and kind of use that to work out how many hours left of knitting you roughly have. Now, in terms of the amount of yarn you have to knit your project, if you are, starting from scratch, and you're knitting maybe from an existing pattern, maybe you're gift knitting, or maybe you're test knitting something that already has, a previous sample made, and so the yarn estimations are more accurate than they would be in the beginning when a designer is just starting from scratch. So if you have those yarn estimations, then that's a relatively good kind of guideline as to how much yarn your project is going to take, and you can use that information to work out how many hours you have left of your project. Now, if you're a designer or maybe a sample knitter where a previous sample hasn't been knitted and the amount of yarn that you have, it might be a bit of an overestimation as to how much the project is going to require. I tend to, as a designer, buy more yarn than I think I will need, just to be on the safe side. I don't want to run out of yarn in the middle of a sample. But if I was doing this process, then I would still use the total amount of yarn that I have for the project to do my estimations, just so that I'm not kind of underestimating the amount of time that it takes. So yeah, that's the best way to ensure that you are going to meet your deadline. And the way that you would work out how many hours you have remaining is you take your amount of yarn that you have left, and then you divide it by the amount of yarn, like grams, that you can knit in an hour. So say you have 500 grams of yarn, and then you know that you can knit 15 grams in an hour, then that will tell you that you can roughly finish your project in about 33 hours. And that's really useful information to have, because you can use that information to kind of allocate blocks of time to work on your sample to ensure that you are going to get, your project done on time. Now, I highly recommend adding a bit of a buffer to that number, because life happens. You never know what will happen in the coming days. As much as you don't anticipate any issues with being able to knit a certain amount each day, it could be that unexpected life circumstances come up. If you're a designer, then you know that ripping does happen, and so it's good to kind of add some extra hours onto that estimation. I would say add a good 5-10 hours onto the estimation that you have, just to be on the safe side. So once you know how long your project is roughly going to take, and you've added on that buffer, you want to take that total amount of time, so time estimation plus buffer, so the total amount, and then divide it by the number of days that you have available. And what that will tell you is roughly how many hours, or whatever amount of time a day you need to be knitting for in order to comfortably meet your deadline. And that's really useful information to have, because it means that you're not consistently working too few hours in the beginning, or not working on it enough in the beginning, and then leave yourself tons and tons of work to do at the very end. It means that you're kind of spreading out the amount of work, and it's just a bit more of a sustainable way to knit, avoids hand pain, allows you to have breaks, that kind of thing. So it's just a brilliant way to kind of make sure that you are making consistent progress on your deadline, and you're gonna be relatively stress-free throughout the process. So to give you an example, if you have 22 days to complete a project, and you know that you have about 40 hours, including buffer, but you have about 40 hours left of your project to do, you know that you need to be knitting for around about 2 hours a day in order to meet that deadline. It's slightly less than 2 hours, but around about 2 hours in order to comfortably meet that deadline. So that just helps you to kind of plan out your days accordingly. It's great as well, because if you know that you have a busy weekend, or a day where you know that you're not going to get any knitting done, you can reallocate the time that you would have spent on the project on those days to other days, so you can kind of make up for the deficit. So this all sounds great in theory, but how do you keep going, keep motivated, and make sure that you're, keeping consistent with the knitting process? One thing that I recommend is you try to be as organised as possible. So keep your project in a project bag, keep the pattern that you're working from with you, whether it's digital or printed pattern. Keep that all there, all the tools that you need, so that whenever you get a chance to sit down and knit, you have everything you need. You're not wasting any time trying to find things. Also, I highly recommend that if you feel like you could do with kind of staying motivated or tracking your progress, then you just keep a little knitting journal. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but it's just like a notepad where you say what you got done that day. Maybe track the amount of time that you worked on it, make sure that you're kind of sticking to the timeline, and yeah, just kind of noting down any sort of deviations to the plan. Say you worked more hours one day, or you worked less hours one day. If you just kind of note that down, it just helps you to kind of see where you're at, see how you're progressing. It can be really helpful to use that notebook to help you kind of review your progress. So if you you're maybe a week into the knitting process and you don't have that much longer left, maybe you want to sort of assess, am I on track? Like, have I knitted enough hours in order to be on track for completing by the deadline? And if you're not, then you can kind of do the same calculation that you did before to kind of work out, okay, well, how do I catch up? How many hours do I need to be knitting now in order to meet that deadline? So you can kind of change the plan as you go along. You don't have to stick to the initial one. If you find that you are falling behind, then you can do the same calculation again and work out, okay, well, what's the new plan? How am I going to catch up? If you're someone who struggles to stay motivated, I get it. If you're a test knitter, a really good way of staying motivated is trying to be active in the test knitting groups. So sharing your progress as you go, keeping the designer updated, kind of getting excited with your fellow test knitters about the projects that you're all working on communally. It kind of feels like a knit along. So that can be a really good way of kind of keeping the momentum going, staying motivated on what you're doing. Say you're a designer and you're not doing like a secret sample knit, then it's a really good idea to, again, share your progress as you're going on your sample, so that not only is it kind of like a good marketing exercise in the sense that it kind of gets people excited about what you have in the works, but for you, it can be really nice to get positive feedback whilst you're knitting the sample. Just to kind of keep the enthusiasm, keep you motivated to keep on working on the sample, even if it is a little bit wearing at times to kind of be working towards a deadline. I know that if you're anything like me, knitting is usually something you prefer to do as more of a leisurely activity, and knitting to deadlines can kind of suck some of the fun out of it. But when you are working towards a goal, you are, making to a deadline, and you're getting all this positive feedback from people who may eventually want to buy the pattern that you're working on, that can do wonders for the motivation and enthusiasm you have about the project. And of course, something that I want to kind of drill down is make sure you take breaks. I learned the hard way from that experience that I told you about earlier, making those amazing wool folk samples, which were beautiful, but my goodness, they hurt my body so much because I was just working so hard on them. I wasn't taking breaks, and yeah, it's just not worth doing that to yourself. So as you're knitting, make sure you schedule in some little breaks. I take a break usually every 30 minutes to kind of just like stretch my hands out, do some exercises, grab a cup of tea. Got to stay hydrated, And yeah, just kind of give my hands a little bit of a breather before continuing on with my knitting session. So I really encourage you that if you love knitting and you want to kind of keep it in your life for as long as possible, then you do take care of your hands and take breaks when you can. And so that really is all there is to it. To recap, I recommend that you set some milestones so that you know exactly how much actual knitting time you have available as opposed to the overall timeline, giving you enough time for blocking and all of that good stuff. And then once you know how much knitting time you have available in terms of like how many days, then you can use your knitting speed to kind of estimate how many hours you need to put in every day in order to meet that deadline. And then of course, just keep organized, stay tracking so that you can kind of adjust your plan as needed. And yeah, do what you can to keep yourself motivated, because I know that knitting to a deadline isn't always the most fun. And so anything you can do to keep yourself motivated and excited is a good thing. As much as I have had stressful experiences knitting to deadlines, I want to reassure you that knitting to a deadline doesn't have to be stressful as long as you do the adequate kind of preparations ahead of it, and you make a good plan that you can follow. It really can be a relatively enjoyable experience, and one that doesn't add too much stress into your life. Now, I'd love to know, do you find yourself knitting to deadlines on a regular basis? I must admit, I tend to avoid them as if I can, but of course it does naturally happen in my job as a knitting pattern designer. And so, it's good to have systems like this that help to keep you going. But if you have any tips of your own that help you stay motivated and on track for meeting your deadlines, then please do share them in the comments, because this is only kind of my experiences, but I'm sure you all have some kind of tips and tricks up your sleeve that would be really valuable to share with the rest of the community. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like it, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss out on any of my knitting pattern design videos or kind of general knitting videos. It's always nice to have some videos to watch whilst you're working on your own projects, right? But until next time, have a lovely week and enjoy your knitting. Bye.